Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm here today with a brilliant new author whose book I just finished, and it absolutely wrecked me. So let's talk about it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Eleanor Shearer, and I'm a mixed race writer from the UK. My debut novel is called River Sing Me Home. It's set just after the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean, and it's all about a woman, Rachel, who's searching for her stolen children.
It's so lovely, and it's so impactful as a read, just emotionally. It hits so beautifully. And before we get more into it, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your journey toward this book, because in addition to your writing, you've had a really interesting career in terms of what you've researched and the places you've worked and things like that. So could you tell us a little bit about that and how it led you to this novel?
Yeah, absolutely. So the seeds of this novel, and also in a way the seeds of what I ended up doing in terms of my academic career, were planted when I was a teenager, and I went to this exhibition called Making Freedom. And it was put on by this charity in the UK called the Windrush Foundation, which does a lot of work around Caribbean heritage and Caribbean history in the UK. And the point of the exhibition was that in the UK, we often learn about the abolition of slavery as something that was done by these benevolent white people, but that doesn't do justice to the agency of enslaved people in the Caribbean who were resisting slavery in ways large and small, from revolutions like the Haitian Revolution all the way to everyday acts of resistance. And it was part of this exhibition. They had this little panel that said, and after emancipation, lots of women put down their tools, left their plantations, and tried to find their children. And that just really stuck with me as an example of resistance to slavery, because so much about slavery was trying to destroy family life. It was trying to deny you a right to your partner, your children, to connect with your ancestors. You know, people would be given new Christian names rather than being able to keep the names that they had back in Africa. And so I just thought this was the ultimate sort of example of bravery, these women who went looking for their children. So that's stuck with me. But in a broader sense, the exhibition also got me interested in the way that we think about slavery here in the UK and how it's different from how slavery is remembered in the Caribbean. So I then went on to university, and I ended up doing a master's degree in politics, where I was looking at the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean and the case for reparations. And it was part of that I ended up doing this fieldwork in the Caribbean that I didn't realize at the time, but would end up being really helpful for the novel. So my grandparents came to the UK from the Caribbean. They were born in Barbados and St. Lucia, so that's where I've got family. So I visited those islands, and I was talking to family members, I was talking to activists, I was talking to historians about how they think about slavery now, if they think it still has an effect on the islands, and what they think about reparations. And a lot of those conversations really helped ground my understanding of what slavery was, the marks that it left on people, the effect on family life in particular that continues to have echoes through the Caribbean today. And it was only after I finished that master's and then was thinking I might want to write this novel idea that had been kicking around for 10 years. I thought, one of the things that held me back from writing this novel was the thought that there was so much research that needed to go into it. And I suddenly realized, hang on, I've done most of the research now because of this master's. So it ended up being incredibly useful for the novel that I then went on to write.
That's so interesting. And I really love that, because I trained as a historian too in my work before I became a library person, and I'm really interested in how kind of history and fiction work together, because like the fiction can let you fill the gaps, that like the historical record has kind of left for us, but at the same time I think that like the fiction can also help us to understand the history better too, by like letting you empathize, and see inside the heads of the people going through these things. Like, so was that something that was kind of driving like the perspective that you took when you wrote this too, or?
Yes, absolutely. And also this novel, and I hope future novels, I'm very interested in Caribbean history and little known parts of history, and a large part of it is also about who gets to leave historical records behind. Although we have some information, a lot of it oral history passed down about the women who went looking for their children, it's not like you can go and look up any written records that they left behind. So that's where, again, fiction really does come in as a chance to imagine as you say, imagine into the gaps that are left in the historical records. And another thing as well that was important to me about this book as a historian, and given the work that I was doing, which was very sort of testimony focused, going to the Caribbean and getting people's perspectives on slavery, I really wanted the book to have an oral history feel to it. And it's very much the story of this one woman, Rachel, but also along her journey, she comes into contact with so many characters who may only be around for a page or two, but all of them have this opportunity to tell a little snippet of their story. And I wanted to have that room on the page for all sorts of people in the Caribbean, be they Black, be they Indigenous, to share a story that you might not otherwise come across in the history books.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me. And it links up to, I think, something that you wrote or said somewhere else about this book being an act of deep witnessing. And that really stuck with me, because I think it allowed me to sort of see history, the practice of history, as not just like an academic practice that we do but something that is itself can be like an act of reclamation or resistance, or of reclaiming identity and collective experience. And I just think that's all like a really lovely way to approach historical fiction.
Yeah, I know, I really appreciate that. And it was something that, again, sprung from my work, because something I was interested in is what I would call the memory gap. So the fact that the way that slavery is remembered in the Caribbean is so different to the UK. And I'm aware I'm about to bring a kind of visual something into an oral medium on a podcast, but I would encourage listeners to go and have a look at these images, because one of the things that I think is so indicative is one of the most famous images of emancipation in the UK was white abolitionists produced this piece of propaganda, and it's by a very famous artist called Josiah Wedgwood, and it's a Black man kneeling, and he's got manacles around his wrists, and he's saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So the idea is appealing to common humanity, but it's an enslaved Black person having to ask for the mercy of white people. Whereas one of the images of emancipation in the Caribbean that I absolutely love, in Barbados, they have a statue, the Emancipation Statue, and it's nicknamed Bussa after a slave that led a rebellion in Barbados in 1816. And this is a Black man who's standing tall, his fists are raised to the sky, and he has chains on his wrists, but he's breaking them. And that idea that in the Caribbean, people remember so strongly acts of resistance, acts of rebellion, and the role that enslaved people played in freeing themselves. Whereas in the UK, we remember the William Wilberforces, we remember the white people that were at the centre of the abolition movement over here. And that sense of needing to close that gap, I really think, reparations is obviously a broad, thorny, controversial topic, but I think as small an act as understanding the way that history is remembered and changing the way that you remember it yourself is a form of reparations. It's a form of literally repair, of healing what has happened, because I think it is a kind of disrespect to the memory of Caribbean people to not be fully aware of all of the resistance that was going on and all of the ways that people made a kind of freedom for themselves outside of slavery.
100%, because I guess like that grand narrative from the perspective of empire is like, yes, we bestowed this upon these people who were just waiting around for us to, and that erases so much agency in like actual historical actors,
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm really curious about, how this history affects the story that you tell, because the novel starts with the Emancipation Act that you've mentioned, and how it is a sort of imagined end to slavery, but it really is so much more complicated than that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how that plays into, one of your main themes, which is just like the many forms that freedom can take and the many forms that the lack of freedom can take. It's like a very wide, complicated spectrum. Could you talk a little bit about your approach to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I very much wanted to set the book in 1834 when, as you mentioned, the Emancipation Act had come into force in the British Caribbean, but the law stated that slaves had to continue to work for 6 years without pay for their former masters. So it was a very hollow kind of freedom, and it itself instigated a whole wave of resistance, and the apprenticeship system, it was called, ended up ending early because of that resistance. But as you say, because I was so interested in this novel to explore what it means to be free, being in that ambiguous moment where by law you are no longer a slave, but what does freedom practically mean if all you can do is continue to work on your former plantation and you're not even allowed any pay? I knew that was the ideal moment to explore that kind of complexity and ambiguity around freedom, and also to make my protagonist Rachel's choice a little bit more stark, because again, it's very deliberate that the novel starts with her leaving her plantation. And I am hugely respectful of art that is about slavery and about the full horrors of slavery. For me, that would have been a very traumatic thing to write. So I wanted this to be a book about what comes after slavery, and the kind of life that you can fashion for yourself, not at all in ideal conditions. At no point in the novel is Rachel coming into huge amounts of wealth, huge amounts of freedom to move about in the world in the way that the most privileged people of her time would have been able to. But I still think she does find freedom in the novel, because it is possible to do that even in conditions of suffering and hardship.
Yeah, and that is, I think, so essential to Rachel's journey. And I would love to talk more about her. I have a couple questions about her. In particular, I was really fascinated by how, like, her choices post-enslavement to, reunite herself with her children and to sort of like learn their stories and what they've been up to, and get them back together again, at least for a moment, and she's on this journey. And that really, like, it fascinated me that is so directly related to like the mechanism of slavery, if that makes sense, because like slavery broke up families in order to, survive. Like that was one of the ways that slavery functioned, and how like then seeking out your family becomes this like really powerful act, so that even if she isn't completely free and she's constrained by all these forces, she's able to claim, agency in her story. So could you talk a little bit about Rachel, what motivates her, and like where she came from, because she is in some historical sources, I believe, right? Or
yes, she is indeed. So this exhibition that I mentioned earlier, I was lucky enough to meet one of the co-founders of the organization that put it on a few years later, and mentioned how 3-4 years on I was still thinking about these women. And he said, oh well, I can lend you a copy of the book that this comes from, and it's a transcription of an oral history of a man called Samuel Smith, who was born in Antigua in the 1870s but lived to be 103, so he was able to kind of pass his story on to his grandchildren in the 20th century. And in that, he remembers, I think it's his great-great-grandmother is a woman called Mother Rachel. And in Antigua, she was in the south of the island on a plantation, and she walked up to the north to find her daughter, Minty, and they were actually able to reunite. So that was one of the examples of where the exhibition had got this idea from, that women went and tried to reunite their families. So Rachel is named in Mother Rachel's honor. But Rachel also comes from somewhere a bit closer to home, because I am in my 20s. I do not have children. I am mixed race, and I'm lucky to have lots of very inspiring Black women in my life. So my mother, my aunt, my step-grandmother, and I never met my grandmother, but I've heard so many amazing stories about her. And those are the women that I was drawing on when I was thinking about Rachel. And in particular, one of the qualities in them that's always interested me is the way that, particularly in public with people that they don't know, they can be very quiet and quite cautious and watchful. And Rachel is quite a cautious character. And that to me is a survival mechanism. It's the way that they've adapted to the sometimes very deeply traumatic things that they have been through because of racism. But at the same time, they are incredibly loving, incredibly generous, and incredibly kind and hopeful and optimistic. And I wanted to capture that dynamic of what are the ways in which you have to change yourself and make yourself different to survive the things that you've been through, but how are you able to maintain elements of yourself? How are you able to, as you say, do this incredibly brave thing of holding on to the idea that you might be able to reunite with your children even after everything you've been through? So yeah, I was drawing on my own family as well as the historical records when I was creating Rachel.
That's so fascinating. And, yeah, I think that might be why she resonates so much, because she does have this like firm historical basis, but also there's like an emotional truth too, that like informs her. Could we talk about that a little bit too in regards to her children and the things that they end up doing, and sort of, how they are able to find their own kinds of freedom, because it's different for all of them. And I was particularly interested in Maroon communities, because I had a professor who studied them as well. And so could you talk a little bit about like, what came after, for the people who had been born into these systems of slavery, but then had to make their own way with like both a new freedom, but also still within obviously like intense constraints,
Yes, absolutely. So I'll speak in general terms without giving too much away about exactly which of Rachel's children fit where, but a few of the forms of freedom that I was interested in exploring in the novel were, first of all, as you mentioned, Maroon communities. So that's runaways who in places in the Caribbean that were more had remote areas. So the novel starts in Barbados, which was small, very densely settled, quite flat landscape. So it was quite hard to find anywhere that wasn't kind of planted already to hide away. But you had other islands like Jamaica, or in the novel Rachel visits British Guiana, what's now Guyana, and there you had these vast swathes of rainforest that had not yet been properly colonized. And so there were these spaces on the edges of the colonies where you could run away and make it there and then form a kind of life for yourself. And in Guyana as well, often that involved intermingling with surviving indigenous communities. So I knew that I wanted to have those communities in the novel. It's obviously a form of freedom that can be quite individualistic, in the sense that it often was about just getting yourself out, and sometimes you would have to leave even very close friends and family behind, because if you got one chance you would have to take it. So it's a choice that didn't come without its costs. And I'm fascinated by, in particular in Jamaica, there were runaway communities that received a kind of recognition from the British because they were so unable to be dispelled from the mountains where they were living, that the British said, okay, well, we're going to sign a treaty with you to recognize your autonomy and we'll stop trying to capture you. But in exchange, many of those communities turned around and started running patrols to pick up runaway slaves and return them to their plantations. So yes, these maroon communities all over the Caribbean, they had to make some very difficult choices in order to safeguard their own freedoms. So that was one kind of idea of freedom in the novel. Another is rebellion and uprising, so armed insurrection against slavery, which is an incredibly bold choice and often unsuccessful. But I guess that's a form of almost more collective attempt to win freedom, because you're saying, I don't think I will be free unless this whole system is brought down, so I'm going to actually take up arms against it. And then finally, and in some ways for me, one of the most difficult forms of freedom to explore is because of the way I look, I've always been interested in the idea of passing. And although Rachel's doesn't have a child who is can pass for white, she does have a child who is mixed race, and so has the possibility of being able to pass herself off as someone who wasn't ever enslaved. And it's very difficult as someone who, I've thought a lot about my own identity and heritage, and I've made this very conscious choice to identify very strongly with my Caribbean roots. But we know for a fact that there were many people for whom freedom meant denying your roots, denying your heritage, cutting off ties with your family, and using that to access more privileged spaces. And so it's a really difficult decision to make. It's kind of the antithesis of Rachel's own journey to try and reassemble her family. But I knew that I had to have that in there in the novel somehow, because it wouldn't really speak to the full spectrum of ways that people were making freedom if I didn't address it, as unpalatable as it may seem to many of us.
Mm. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective too, because, not all responses are equally, as you say, appealing to people who get to read from like, the privilege of not having lived through this and just looking at it from a later date. Um, but it also occurs to me, like, as you were speaking, that a lot of here too, like what shapes people's choices in terms of how they seek freedom is also a lot of like very inflected by trauma response, because um, I've often thought about how like one response to trauma is to like isolate yourself and protect yourself from it ever happening again and just look out for you. But then there's also the response of like, well, no, like I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else either, while I protect myself. And, I feel like having that sort of empathetic view on all of the choices that were available and what might have shaped those choices was very I'm trying to like just very nuanced and very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And yeah, the research that I was doing for my master's was in lots of ways about trauma and how we respond to trauma. And in particular, another big theme of the novel, I think, is the things that we can and we cannot say. So again, a very deliberate choice for the novel to be about what comes after slavery, but slavery clearly casts a very long shadow on all of the characters and all of their choices, as you say, and often they can't speak that out loud and they have to rely on just sort of these moments of silence where you have to fill in the gaps, and that itself speaks to trauma. Absolutely.
I'm so happy that you came to talk to the show, and I'm really, really glad that you've written this book. I thank you so much for, giving it to the world. And I think that we're all going to be really excited to see what you do next. So I was wondering, do you have plans for further novels to either revisit these characters or, show us some new ones, or do you have plans for further writing?
I do, and I think I have not yet fully mined the theme of what it means to be free and this ambiguous time around the end of slavery. So I'm actually working on a new novel that's going to be set in Nova Scotia, and it's all about the communities of formerly enslaved people, both from Jamaica and from the United States, that ended up in the barren, cold Nova Scotia landscape, trying to make a life for themselves and a new home for themselves. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Oh, wow. I'm very excited to see like a totally different sort of landscape and how too. I hope that you'll consider coming back to talk to us again when the episode is ready for us. All right, listeners. So I highly suggest that you pick up River Sing Me Home. It is an absolutely beautiful, moving, and really thought-provoking book that will stay with you. So please, yes, visit your favorite independent bookstore or library and pick up a copy. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Turn the Page, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.